About a Good Woman is a four-act comedy by Oscar Wilde, first performed on Saturday the 20th of February 1892, at the St. James's Theatre in London. The story concerns Lady Windermere, who suspects that her husband is having an affair with another woman. She confronts him with it. Although he denies it, he invites the other woman, Mrs. Erlynne, to his wife's birthday ball. Angered by her husband's supposed unfaithfulness, Lady Windermere decides to leave her husband for another lover. After discovering what has transpired, Mrs. Erlynne follows Lady Windermere and attempts to persuade her to return to her husband, and in the course of this, Mrs. Erlynne is discovered in a compromising position. It is then revealed that Mrs. Erlynne is Lady Windermere's mother, who abandoned her family 20 years before the time the play is set. Mrs. Erlynne sacrifices herself and her reputation to save her daughter's marriage. By the summer of 1891, Wilde had already written 3 plays. Vera, or The Nihilists, and The Duchess of Padua had found little success, and Salome had yet to be staged. Unperturbed, he decided to write another play but turned from tragedy to comedy. He went to the Lake District in the north of England, where he stayed with a friend and later met Robert Ross. Numerous characters in the play appear to draw their names from the north of England. Lady Windermere from the lake in nearby town Windermere, though Wilde had used Windermere earlier in Lord Arthur Saville's Crime, the Duchess of Berwick from Berwick-upon-Tweed, Lord Darlington from Darlington. Wilde began writing the play at the prodding of George Alexander, the actor-manager of St. James's Theatre. The play was finished by October. Alexander liked the play, and offered him an advance of £1,000 for it. Wilde, impressed by his confidence, opted to take a percentage instead, from which he would earn £7,000 in the first year alone, worth £809,900 today. Alexander was a meticulous manager, and he and Wilde began exhaustive revisions and rehearsals of the play. Both were talented artists with strong ideas about their art. Wilde, for instance, emphasized attention to aesthetic minutiae rather than realism. He resisted Alexander's suggested broad stage movements, quipping that details are of no importance in life, but in art details are vital. These continued after the opening night when, at the suggestion of both friends and Alexander, Wilde made changes to reveal Mrs. Erlynne's relationship with Lady Windermere gradually throughout the play, rather than reserving the secret for the final act. Despite these artistic differences, both were professional and their collaboration was a fruitful one. There is an extant manuscript of the play held in the William Andrews Clark Memorial Library at the University of California, Los Angeles. Summary. Act 1. The play opens in the morning room of the Windermere's residence in London. It is tea time, and Lady Windermere, who is preparing for her coming-of-age birthday ball that evening, has a visit from a friend, Lord Darlington. She shows off her new fan, a present from her husband. She explains to Lord Darlington that she is upset over the compliments he continues to pay to her, revealing that she has very particular views about what is acceptable in society, due in part to her somewhat Puritan upbringing. The Duchess of Berwick calls and Lord Darlington leaves shortly thereafter. The Duchess informs Lady Windermere that her husband may be betraying her marriage by making repeated visits to another woman, a Mrs. Erlynne, and possibly giving her large sums of money. These rumors have been gossip among London society for quite a while, though seemingly this is the first Lady Windermere has heard about it. Following the departure of the Duchess, Lady Windermere decides to check her husband's bank book. She finds the book in a desk and sees that nothing appears amiss, though on returning she discovers a second bank book, one with a lock. After prying the lock open, she finds it lists large sums of money given to Mrs. Erlynne. At this point, Lord Windermere enters and she confronts him. Though he cannot deny that he has had dealings with Mrs. Erlynne, he states that he is not betraying Lady Windermere. He requests that she send Mrs. Erlynne an invitation to her birthday ball that evening to help her back into society. When Lady Windermere refuses, he writes out an invitation himself. Lady Windermere makes clear her intention to cause a scene if Mrs. Erlynne appears, to which Lord Windermere responds that it would be in her best interest not to do so. Lady Windermere leaves in disgust to prepare for the party, and Lord Windermere reveals in soliloquy that he is protecting Mrs. Erlynne's true identity to save his wife extreme humiliation. What shall I do? I dare not tell her who this woman really is. The shame would kill her. Lord Windermere. Act 2. Act 2 opens in the Windermere's drawing room during the birthday ball that evening. Various guests enter, and make small talk. Lord Windermere enters and asks Lady Windermere to speak with him, but she brushes him off. A friend of Lord Windermere's, Lord Augustus Lorden Tuppy, pulls him aside to inquire about Mrs. Erlyn, with whom he is enamored. Lord Windermere reveals that there is nothing untoward in his relationship with Mrs. Erlyn, and that she will be attending the ball, which comes as a great relief to Lord Augustus as he was worried about her social standing. After an unsuccessful attempt to make peace with his wife, Lord Windermere summons the courage to tell the truth to her, but at that moment Mrs. Erlyn arrives at the party, where she is greeted coldly by Lady Windermere, spoiling his plan. Alone, Lady Windermere and Lord Darlington discuss Mrs. Erlyn's attendance. Lady Windermere is enraged and confused and asks Lord Darlington to be her friend. Instead of friendship, Lord Darlington takes advantage of Lady Windermere's tragic state and professes his love to her, offering her his life, and inviting her to risk short-term social humiliation for a new life with him. Lord Darlington sets her an ultimatum to try to convince her to take action immediately, while still in a state of shock. Lady Windermere is shocked by the revelation, and finds she does not have the courage to take the offer. Heartbroken, Lord Darlington announces that he will be leaving the country the next day and that they will never meet again, and leaves. The guests begin to leave, and say their goodnights to Lady Windermere, some remarking positively about Mrs. Erlyn. On the other side of the room Mrs. Erlyn is discussing her plans with Lord Windermere. She intends to marry Lord Augustus and will require some money from Lord Windermere. Later, Lady Windermere, in spite of her earlier reluctance, decides to depart the house at once for Lord Darlington, and leaves a note to that effect for Lord Windermere. Mrs. Erlyn discovers the note and that Lady Windermere has gone, and is curiously worried by this revelation. While reading the note, a brief monologue reveals that she is in fact Lady Windermere's mother and made a similar mistake herself 20 years previously. She takes the letter and exits to locate Lady Windermere. How can I save her? How can I save my child? A moment might ruin a life. Who knows that better than I? M.R. Serlin. Act 3. Lady Windermere is alone in Lord Darlington's rooms, unsure if she has made the right decision. Eventually she resolves to return to her husband, but then Mrs. Erlyn appears. Despite Mrs. Erlyn's honest attempts to persuade her to return home to her husband, Lady Windermere is convinced her appearance is part of some plot conceived by her and Lord Windermere. Mrs. Erlyn finally breaks Lady Windermere's resistance by imploring her to return for the sake of her young child, but as they begin to exit they hear Lord Darlington entering with friends. The two women hide. The men, who include Lord Windermere and Lord Augustus, have been evicted from their gentlemen's club at closing time and talk about women, mainly Mrs. Erlyn. One of them takes notice of a fan lying on a table, Lady Windermere's, and presumes that Lord Darlington presently has a woman visiting. As Lord Windermere rises to leave, the fan is pointed out to him, which he instantly recognizes as his wife's. He demands to know if Lord Darlington has her hidden somewhere. Lord Darlington refuses to cooperate, believing that Lady Windermere has come to him. Just as Lord Windermere is about to discover Lady Windermere's hiding place, Mrs. Erlyn reveals herself instead, shocking all the men and allowing Lady Windermere to slip away unnoticed. I am afraid I took your wife's fan in mistake for my own, when I was leaving your house tonight. I am so sorry. M.R. Serlin. Act 4. The next day, Lady Windermere is lying on the couch of the morning room anxious about whether to tell her husband what actually happened, or whether Mrs. Erlyn will have already betrayed her secret. Her husband enters. He is sympathetic towards her and suggests that as the London season is almost over that they head to their country estate to forget the recent incident. Lady Windermere apologizes for her previous suspicion of her husband and behavior at the party, and Lord Windermere makes clear his new contempt for Mrs. Erlyn, warning his wife to stay away from her. Mrs. Erlyn's arrival is announced along with the return of the fan, and despite her husband's protestations, Lady Windermere insists on seeing her. Mrs. Erlyn enters and states that she shall be going abroad, but asks that Lady Windermere give her a photograph of herself and her son. Whilst Lady Windermere leaves the room to find one, the story is revealed. Mrs. Erlyn left her husband for a lover shortly after Lady Windermere's birth. When her new lover abandoned her, Mrs. Erlyn was left alone and in disrepute. More recently, using the assumed name of Mrs. Erlin, she has begun blackmailing Lord Windermere to regain her lifestyle and status, by threatening to reveal her true identity as Lady Windermere's shameful mother, not dead, as Lady Windermere believes. Her son-in-law, Lord Windermere, laments not having told his wife the whole story at once and resolves to tell her the truth now. Mrs. Erlin forbids him to do so, threatening to spread shame far and wide if he does. Lady Windermere returns with the photograph which she presents to Mrs. Erlin, and requests that Lord Windermere check for the return of Mrs. Erlin's coach. Now that they are alone, and being owed a favor, Mrs. Erlin demands that Lady Windermere not reveal the truth about the events of the previous night to Lord Windermere, and Lady Windermere promises to keep the secret. After Lord Windermere's return, Lord Augustus enters. He is shocked to see Mrs. Erlin after the events of the night before, but she requests his company as she heads to her carriage, and he soon returns to the Windermeres with news that she has satisfactorily explained the events of the evening, and that they are to marry and live out of England. Lady Windermere, taking her husband's hand, to Lord Augustus, "Ah, you're marrying a very good woman." Their marriage is restored, but both Lord and Lady Windermere keep their secrets. Themes. By showing in St. James's, Wilde was targeting a fashionable, upper-middle-class audience, and Wilde maps out the geography of their world, Grosvenor Square, Curzon Street, the park, with precision. 12 Peter Raby has also highlighted Lady Windermere's fan as a good example of Wilde's most successful dramatic technique, the juxtaposition of the comic and the serious. Once the absurd and the patently false have been established, the serious emotions and ideas which are explored have been given a setting which prevents them from ever becoming too serious. 13. Scholar Paul Fortunato describes Oscar Wilde as a modernist, who used his modern aesthetics so as to direct him into the realm of mass culture. Wilde's huge popularity as a playwright began with his production of Lady Windermere's Fan, his recherché attitude and personal aesthetics reflected in his writing. Fortunato elaborates on the facets of his aestheticism, an aestheticism that distorts and lies on the surface, rejects any notion of an authentic self, and centers on the female aesthete and woman of fashion. As he describes, understanding Wilde as a modernist through his writing of Lady Windermere's Fan can help us understand the disparity between mass culture and high society. Wilde bridges this by theorizing his modern aesthetics beneath the ornamental surface of fashion and elite society. The fan that strings together the play's scenes simultaneously evokes a traditional symbol of modesty while revealing a truly modern current of infidelity.